so good to see familiar faces and some that I haven't seen in a little while, but I'm really happy to see colleagues as well as students in here. I am Eurydice Bauer, and I'm the Director of Bilingualism Matters, and I want to introduce you to two other important people, co-directors of Bilingualism Matters, Dr. Lenny Sanchez. And so for those of you who are not familiar with Bilingualism Matters, we engage in research and activities related to bilingualism matters as well as other related topics in and out of school. And as part of that, we run a series in the spring where we invite someone to come and talk to us who's not from USC, who's well known and who can bring some perspective on some of these issues and topics that we're entertaining here. So we're very lucky to have Dr. Allison Skerrett with us. She is renowned nationally and internationally, so it really is quite a treat to have her with us. What we'll do today is that we'll have someone formally introduce her, who will follow me. Dr. Skerrett will speak, and then we'll open it up for question and discussion element to it. When you pose a question, if you would just say who you are and what your status is, if you're a faculty, if you're a student, or what have you. So I'll turn the floor over to Anthonia Awhinawhi, who will introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this event, and thank you for joining us for what promises to be an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. It is an honor to introduce Dr. Allison Skerrett, a distinguished scholar whose work has significantly shaped the fields of literacy, teacher education, and transnational youth studies. Dr. Skerrett is the Barbie M. and Gary L. Coleman Endowed Professor in Education and the Director of Teacher Education in the College of Education at the University of Texas at Austin, where she has made remarkable contributions to research, teaching, and educational leadership. Her work centers on the literacy practices of youth of color, the complexities of secondary English education in urban contexts, and the role of transnationalism in shaping literacy and identity. She's the author of Teaching to Transnational Youth, which is the first book to examine the educational challenges and needs faced by students who live and attend schools across different countries. Her most recent book, co-authored with Peter Smagorinsky, titled Teaching Literacy in Troubled Times, explores how contemporary socio-political crises provide both educators and students with critical opportunities for literacy learning and social action. Dr. Skerrett's groundbreaking research has been published in top-tier research journals, academic journals, including Reading Research Quarterly, Journal of Literacy Research, Research in the Teaching of English, and Urban Education. Her contributions have been recognized through prestigious honors such as Literacy Research Association's Early Career Achievement Award and the Edward B. Fry Book Award. She also serves as an editor for the Journal of Literacy Research and is actively engaged in national and international education policy efforts, including serving on the U.S. National Assessment of Educational Progress Panel for Reading, Scotland's International Council of Education Advisors, and Caribbean Examinations Council Research Advisory Board. Today, she'll be speaking on Raciolinguistics across transnational educational contexts. Her research challenges us to rethink and think about how language, race, and identity intersect in educational spaces, particularly in the experience of transnational youth. And as literacy educators, as researchers, as advocates, this conversation is crucial in understanding how we can engage across cultural and linguistic borders and boundaries and dismantle colonialist logics in education. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Allison Skerrett.
much. And the longer I'm doing this, the older I feel after these introductions, because it feels like people feel there's more and more to say. And maybe now I'm going to say, like, maybe just cut out some of the early stuff so I don't feel quite so old as you go on and on. But thank you so much, Anthonia, and thank you to all of you for being here on this late and quite gorgeous afternoon. So thank you for spending the early part of your evening with me. I'm delighted to be here. This is my first visit to the University of South Carolina, and so it's a real pleasure. I want to, of course, thank Dr. Bauer, my colleague and dear friend. Thank you for inviting me here to speak. Thank you for the wonderful hospitality that you and all of the students and faculty have shown me here from my arrival yesterday afternoon. Dr. Lenny Sanchez, so good to see you. Thank you for all you've done to make this visit happen. And my newest friend that I've just met, who I don't want to say just your first name, so you have to remind me of your last name, because we're in a professional setting now. Wang, Dr. Young Wang, so thank you as well for being here. I had a great morning with many of the students in language and literacy, and some in teaching and learning as well, thinking about our research interests and what it means to have a research trajectory beginning now as early career scholars. So I'm happy to continue the conversation this afternoon. And finally, I want to give a shout out to my wonderful mentee in Cultivating New Voices of MCTE, Janice Baines. So it's lovely to see you. Thank you for being here. And just looking forward to our time together. So, Anthonia, thank you again for the introduction and for introducing the very long title of my talk, which I won't have to repeat since you've already said it. This is newer thinking for me. This area of thinking with Raciolinguistics theory. And when I say it's newer thinking, I mean it's newer thinking in terms of talking about these ideas in scholarly context and writing about it in scholarly papers. But in fact, as very early on in the talk, you will see these are ideas that I have been living with and experiencing and thinking about as a scholar, as a person in the world. And so it's a privilege to start to be able to think about these ideas in I think, more formal academic spaces. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation that I think will really help sort of push my thinking as I continue in this area. So in terms of a framework for where we're headed over the next hour or so, you know, identity, of course, always matters in everything that we do, including in our scholarship. So I will start by just with some biographical commentary on how I come to this work as a language speaker. And so I'll share a little bit of my language background to sort of frame our conversation this evening. I will share some very brief insights from the body of literature on transnationalism as it relates to language and youth of color. And then I will share from some research with a particular focus on two students, not two students, but students from two settings in which English is one of the sort of official languages. Language is the power for them. So transnational students with experiences in their home countries and in the US. Those stories, what they have to share about their experiences languaging across these different settings will help us think about racial linguistics theory at work in their home countries as post-colonial countries and also Euro-Western settings, in particular North America. And finally, we'll wrap up with some implications, thinking in particular about what the insights from these young people could mean for literacy pedagogy. Okay, so you see two photographs on the screen here. The one on my right to your left, is that correct? Yes, is an image of the home that I grew up in Dominica. So I was born in Dominica, which is an island in the Caribbean. I have to say that sometimes because not everyone has heard of my lovely country. And so it's an English-speaking nation officially. However, this is an island that changed hands quite a bit between Great Britain and the French. And so because of that, there are strong influences, French influences as well, on the island. Clearly, the French lost permanently the island because I'm speaking English to you right now. And so official schooling and government life is carried on in English. But many of the people who live there speak a French Creole, which is actually very similar to Haitian Creole. And so, although that was a language that I was not taught as a child, my family, many members of my family spoke that French Creole. In fact, in my family, I came to sort of understand it as a language for the adults, because whenever the children would be in the company of adults and they were having conversations, I could tell when the conversation was taking a turn that they thought was unfit for children, because then they would switch over into French Creole, so I would be in the room but not really understanding, except that I was understanding this was adult stuff that I wasn't intended to be privy to. And so while I can grasp particular phrases and words, I don't have fluency in that language. I also learned French as a formal language during my schooling there. That becomes important because you'll see some data where you see some young people also talking about these formal European languages that to this day children and students are required to learn in school as official subjects, acquire enough proficiency in that they have to display on school leaving examinations. So these are not, these are high stakes sort of language policies for students in the Caribbean. And so I lived and went to school in Dominica through the age of 15. And after that, immigrated to the US. And so the picture, this photograph here, if you are familiar with Boston, is an iconic image of the Red Line. And so I moved to Boston at 15 years old and entered a very different cultural and linguistic landscape at that point. Entered high school in Boston public schools and had to do a lot of figuring out in terms of who I now was as a cultural person and as certainly as a speaker of language. In school in Boston, I came to learn that my ways of speaking English were wrong. I was using a British form of spelling that my teachers were constantly correcting because I spelled daughter with an H and that was wrong, and I put a U, an O and a U in neighborhood, and that was also wrong. Beyond sort of these sort of official ways that I was taught that my ways with English were wrong, in the sort of linguistic social milieu of life, my ways of speaking English was also wrong. And so the community in which I lived, if you're familiar with the East Coast at all, it's a very culturally and linguistically complex space. So a lot of African American language, very strong Caribbean community, but that's a very diverse geographic group. So we had Haitian immigrants, folks from Honduras, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, just everywhere that you can imagine. And so there was not one way of speaking English as someone from the Caribbean, and then we had, of course, folks from different African nations and really from all over the world. In that social space, African American language held, I would say, more value and privilege, right, in that social context. Those were the cool kids, and those were the kids who could sort of judge and censor your language, so that your degree of belonging really depended on your proximity to African American language. And so reading this social space, I had to make some decisions about how I would then walk through the world. And so I made some very deliberate decisions about working on my accented English, because my early experiences, as soon as I opened my mouth, was like, where are you from? and what language do they speak, and where is that? And as a 15-year-old, that was socially difficult, and so I did my best to sort of get rid of that Caribbean accent so that I could fit in. I hear it's a lot cooler now to be from the Caribbean than it was in the 80s when I was coming up in Boston. But that was sort of the setting there. So picking up African American language was a very deliberate language project for me. Getting rid of the Caribbean accent. I haven't quite lost it if you're listening carefully, and I'm thankful for that actually. And then also there was white English to contend with, because that was the language, the real language of power once I stepped out of Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, which are really the historically black communities of Boston. And so further work to do in terms of listening to the media and really figuring out how I would sort of familiarize myself and take up this language of power so that when I sort of stepped out into the world of work and as I got further into my professional life, I'm able to speak in particular ways that are recognized to an extent as professional sort of white English. So that is sort of a bit of my language history and background that brings me to this work. I've lived and worked now in Austin, Texas for 18 years. I don't believe I have a Texan twang at all, but I've become quite familiar and comfortable with saying y'all in my speech. So morning y'all, how's it going? Hey y'all. And so a few years ago I was having a conversation with one of my professors from graduate school. So I got my doctorate from Boston College, and he had lived in Houston and taught at Rice for a while. And I was talking with him, and then he said, wait a minute, did I just hear you say y'all? And I was like, I must have done that, Dennis. And so there's a little bit of that there, but I think overall, my language influences are from, of course, my nation of birth and origin, and certainly the East Coast, and the language settings that we're all immersed in terms of what we hear on the media and what we're taught is valued in this society. And so, so you've heard a bit of my story also as someone who's lived across nations and attended school in two different countries, which brings me to one of the key concepts that grounds my work, which is transnationalism. And when I was speaking with the doctoral students this morning, I was sharing that in my earlier research, I really framed the students that have been of interest to me for many years now and myself as an immigrant. But as I got deeper into my scholarship and began reading in the area of transnationalism, I was quite pleased to sort of encounter this idea and to think about how it really reframes and reshapes people from sort of this idea of an immigrant who sort of made this permanent move to a new country and sort of left behind, their old ways of knowing and being and their old communities, and have sort of permanently sort of taken up a new sort of identity in a new space. Transnationalism really reframes that to helping us think about people having multiple belongings to more than one nation state, being of both here and there, and continuing in many ways to maintain active ties to their nations of origin and to their new nations. And so there are a variety of ways in which people enact being transnational and multiple means through which they do that. In our day and age, digital tools and the media are key ways in which people can continue to be transnational, even when financial reasons or political reasons might sort of prevent or limit physical travel or frequent border crossing across nations. And so I use the term transnationalism now in my work to think about the young people with whom I work, and to also reposition myself and my family as transnational people as a way to acknowledge and index that we remain firmly connected to our homelands and see a lot of value in that. And so in terms of a bit of a framing in terms of the literature, getting closer into what we're talking about this evening, In more recent years, scholars have been paying attention to the languaging experiences of transnational people of color in and across Euro-Western nations as they sort of engage with language in these nations. So particularly looking at the ways in which particular racialized bodies, particularly black and brown bodies, sort of experience language, Euro-Western languages in these contexts. And I want to offer, and I want to also sort of signal early work, such as the work of Edward Glissant, and also Dr. Patrian Smith at the University of South Florida, who's an active scholar currently in this space. It's important to sort of think about other spaces, other national contexts that are also multilingual spaces, where people inside of those spaces are also doing a lot of work with these European languages and also contending with the ways in which race intersects with language in these spaces. And so across my work on transnationalism, I've really been working to bring attention to the transnational experiences of youth of color with origins in the Caribbean, because I feel like these spaces have quite a bit to teach us as well. And I think it can sort of broaden the conversation. It can help generate some understandings that could be applied to different national contexts where English and other Euro-Western languages are still quite significant in how people sort of experience educational and social life. Okay, so I'm working with the concept of raciolinguistics theory to sort of frame this work that broadly examines the relationships among language, race, and power, leaning quite extensively on the work of Rosa and Flores, just a series of scholarly pieces that they have contributed to the field. And more recent work that specifically thinks about the relationships among language, race, and coloniality in global contexts where wide European conquest has involved the imposition of English, Spanish, and other Euro-Western languages as languages of power, and which essentially also function as languages of oppression. And so racial linguistics ideologies function in ways that conflate black, in particular black and brown bodies with linguistic deficiency that are really unrelated to any objective ways of assessing what may be correct and proper in terms of ways of speaking a language. Racial linguistics ideologies contend that even when black and brown bodies speak a form of a standard language that could be recognized as acceptable if their speech were to be emanating from a white speaking subject, that speech is still heard and perceived to be deficient or non-normative. Flores and Rosa, within the scholarship of racial linguistics ideologies, offer us two sort of important ideas to think with. One is the white gaze, and the other is the white listening subject. It's important for us to think about these positions as we look at post-colonial contexts, because there's some real complexity there, so in Caribbean spaces. For example, as I will show you with some data. And so these positions of the white gaze and white listening subject may be occupied by people with white skin, but can also be occupied by black and brown folks as well. The position is really a position of power that sort of is in a position to evaluate and assess and assign either rewards or not to minoritized speakers of Euro-Western languages. And so we'll see how that sort of functions in post-colonial spaces as well. I do have to pause and say a special hello Hello, Dr. Long. It is such a pleasure to see you. I had no idea that you would be here this evening.
I just found out this afternoon.
Oh my gosh, so I'm so pleased. Thank you so much for being here. I mentioned Janice and our connection to CNV, and Dr. Long has been a long mentor in cultivating new voices as well. So it's been a pleasure to work with her over several cycles of mentors and mentees in CNV, and Dr. Bauer has also served as a mentor in CNV as well. So it's nice to see some of the family here tonight. Thanks for being here. Okay, all right, so we've got our theoretical framework, and now let's get into some of the data. So the data I'll be sharing from is an ongoing, and I'm sorry I'm squinting, I keep looking this way and then I squint, an ongoing qualitative inquiry that so this work that I've been doing since around 2012, 2013, in which I'm examining the language and literacy practices and the social and educational experiences of transnational youth of color. I've had a particular focus on youth of color with origins in the Caribbean, and the island of St. Martin, particularly Dutch St. Martin, has been a space in which I've done quite a bit of research, and that context is very rich. St. Martin is the #1 sort of hub for intra-Caribbean migration, and so what that means is that for many people in Caribbean nations that have economic challenges where it might be harder to find jobs and living wages, St. Martin has historically been a hub for folks to leave places like Dominica or St. Lucia, other places that might have more significant economic challenges, and to migrate to St. Martin and find work in a very booming tourist industry. The island remains under the governance of the Dutch. And so Dutch remains one of the official languages there. In reality, English really is the lingua franca of that space. And so you can find people from just about every Caribbean island on St. Martin, as well as from lots of other places in the world. So it's an incredibly complex and rich transnational space, and it's really been a privilege to be able to think with theory inside of that space and with young people who live in that space and who cross borders between St. Martin and other countries, including French St. Martin, which is one shared landmass, but also quite distinct as a cultural and political space. So very rich opportunities there in the Caribbean. I'm a qualitative researcher, and so rely on qualitative methods for most of my scholarship. I've also done some design-based research working with young people there in literacy classrooms, which has been a really rich opportunity as well. But the data from which I will be sharing tonight, data that has been collected through interviews, observations, and the literacy artifacts from young people. So I guess the last thing I will say, you won't see much of this in this talk, but it's been important for me to sort of reframe earlier work that I've done as well, when I used sort of the frame of immigrant students, and to rethink think with that data through the lens of transnationalism. And so, for example, in the book Teaching Transnational Youth, I've been able to sort of return to data that I collected even as a doctoral student while I was dissertating. I'm collecting doing interviews with teachers who taught in these really linguistically and culturally complex classrooms, and to sort of reposition these teachers as teachers of transnational students, to rethink these students not just as immigrant students to Canada, but to reframe them as transnational students, and to draw on some of that data to inform my work as well. For this evening, we'll be sort of just hearing from the insights of students who have school experiences in Dutch St. Martin, and then one student from New Delhi, India, who has experiences in that region of the world, and then also in North America, drawing from primarily interview data and reflective writings, particularly in the case of the student from India who took on the pseudonym of Prisha. And so I guess the other thing I will say here just in terms of data and method is that I use thematic analysis to sort of come to these findings that relate to how the young people understand their language practices and experiences relative to race and coloniality. Okay, so we'll dive into some data, but I'll first frame that with sort of three findings, if you will, from this work. The first being seeing how raciolinguistics functions in educational policies and practices that then shape the academic experiences and identities of the students in these settings. Secondly, thinking about how the young people negotiate and sort of display social and political rights to the different transnational nations to which they belong through their ways with language, through multiple Englishes and accents. So a really dynamic way of thinking about the agency of the young people as users of multiple Englishes across these different settings. And thirdly, we'll think about how the young people, this is a better spot, forge a multilingual community as a means to combat racialized linguistic violence that they have experienced as a function of their ways of speaking English across these transnational contexts. Okay, so a little bit of framing in terms of the linguistic context of St. Martin. I've been telling you sort of about the rich cultural space that it is. As a function of all of this intra-Caribbean migration and St. Martin's colonial history, you have multiple languages spoken in this very complex space. So English, Creole, French, Spanish, Papiamento, Dutch, Sri-Lanka, various Chinese dialects, Hindu, Urdu, Arab-speaking, and Italian groups, all in this very tiny land space. And apart from Arab-speaking and Italian, unless I was not aware of it, I've had an opportunity to work with young people on St. Martin that actually claim all of these really rich language backgrounds. So as one example, a young woman I worked with, we call Victoria, this is an excerpt from an interview that I conducted with her, in which I'm trying to sort of understand the linguistic, her linguistic background and her linguistic repertoire. She speaks about a father who's from Dominica and a mother who's Jamaican, and about the rich linguistic space in their home. Her father speaks English, of course, Creole. As a Dominican, he's got that French patois. He also has learned some Spanish, living in St. Martin. Her mother, of course, English and Jamaican patois. Her grandmother lives in Curacao and so speaks Papiamento as well. And so through all of this, I've been sort of asking her, well, do you speak any of these languages? How much do you understand or engage with these languages? And it was very curious to me that she kept positioning herself as only a speaker of English. Until we get to sort of the end of this excerpt, that she was like, yeah, I understand a little bit. I'll speak a little bit of Papiamento when I'm with my grandmother in Curacao. I'm curious about this example because it makes me think a little bit of what subtractive multilingualism might look like in this space, where the student clearly has access to all of these rich languages, but has been taught to, I think, by a social context, to think about herself as just a speaker of English, and what it might mean to have a sort of language pedagogy that might enable Victoria to reposition herself as a multilingual speaker that she clearly is. But her story clearly demonstrates some of the really rich linguistic landscape, which is this nation of St. Martin in which she lives. Okay, thinking then about the educational context and how language policies and practices function in education. And again, this is both in St. Martin and more broadly in the Caribbean. That the colonial languages are still by and large the languages of instruction in school. What's I think important to think about is not so much as how is that or not a problem, but what that means for how other languages, local languages, are positioned vis-a-vis these colonial languages. The idea that oftentimes the home language is presented as inferior, inadequate, unfit for teaching or learning, or even not recognized as a language at all. And that is certainly how I experienced schooling in the Caribbean, that our local ways of speaking English and playing with language, which were just so rich. I was, actually my sister, a little aside, my sister lives in Lexington, and stopped by for a little visit, and we were in the parking lot, and she and her husband loved to garden, and they were like, "What are you talking about?" And I was explaining to, folks who are not academics, this academic talk that I was giving tonight, but they love to garden, and so she was showing me some of the fruits that they grew in their garden. And she showed me this watermelon, which was really misshapen and long, and she was proud of it, and I was impressed that she had grown this watermelon in her garden. And I said, "Oh, that's not the kind of watermelon they would put on the shelf in the supermarket. The watermelons are perfectly rounded, and I said, nobody would buy that watermelon. That's a Calbose watermelon." And we all laugh. None of you probably know what that means, but it just means misshapen. It's not round, it's not perfect, it's not beautiful. But so all of these really wonderful words that we made up, and it wasn't just that we made them up, these were words that were part of our language, our English, were things that we would joke around on the playground or what have you, but when it was time for formal English education, those words did not belong in the classroom. So anyways, other scholars then are calling for Caribbean, in this case, Caribbean educators to really engage in a critical form of literacy in which we deconstruct these language policies and think about how they then shape people's relationships to their local languages, to their heritage or indigenous languages. In the Caribbean, we continue to draw on European models of education, more recently American models of education and teaching styles, and have yet to really craft for ourselves a pedagogy for Caribbean students. And I would venture that, as we'll see, certainly in one context and with one student's experiences, many other parts of the world that are continuing to bear the legacies of colonialism need to be thinking in these ways as well. Again, these are not neutral practices. They have real consequences for the academic and social outcomes and lives for you. So one example is a student I've written about that we call Monica, who was born on Dutch St. Martin and attended school there until about 9 years old, and then moved to Florida with her dad and stepmom, and went through most of secondary school in Florida, and she was about to enter secondary, her senior year of high school. Her father had just made a sudden return move back to St. Martin. Socially, this was very difficult for her, but academically, it posed real problems for her, because on St. Martin, Dutch is an official sort of school subject. Students are required to pass a school leaving exam in Dutch in order to earn a high school diploma. That was, as you can imagine, really hard for her. She'd not lived in that country for many years, had lost her fluency with Dutch. And so as someone going into her senior year of high school in the US, she comes back to St. Martin and is put into the equivalent of 9th grade, because she struggles with Dutch. And so she, to her credit, tries very hard for a couple of years to sort of stick with it with the encouragement of her mother and family friends, but it became too hard for her to sort of to sort of be in this space where she was just not being successful with the language. She left the official public schools and tried a private school, which also wasn't working quite well for her, and ended up, I wouldn't say dropping out, but really getting pushed out of school because she could not pass this Dutch exam. I wouldn't necessarily call it a happy ending, but an agentive ending. She was eventually able to earn her GED, and so then proceed on with her life with having completed, with some form of completion of high school. But this is one example of the really significant challenges that are posed to young people in spaces where these languages continue to really shape their academic experiences. Another example is of a young man named Jackie who talks about his experience in this Dutch language class. Here what I want to point to is how students who come from family backgrounds where these European languages is the home language have this sort of advantage, if you will, over students who do not come from these language backgrounds. And so Jackie's talking about sort of zoning out a bit because these languages are incredibly difficult for students to sort of gain proficiency in as a school subject, whereas those who are of a Dutch background or French or Spanish sort of seem to have an easier time finding academic success in school. This example is from a student named Sasha, and here she is pointing to the ways in which, thinking back with theory, the sort of the white gaze or the white listening subject can really be occupied by people of color themselves in these post-colonial settings. So she's talking about her English teacher who is a black Jamaican teacher who speaks with a British accent and who has the position of really assessing, evaluating, and really policing students' ways of speaking English. And so it's really, I think, important to take these views into these particular settings to sort of understand the contemporary dynamics with the colonizers having long left, thinking about how these legacies continue to function in very insidious ways, and what does this mean for the language education of teachers themselves. Where is Wes? Who is very interested in, I think, transnational teachers of color and what they may be bringing to classrooms, right? But how do we think about the preparation of teachers for working with transnational students? Okay, I think I'll skip over this part of it to keep us sort of moving along here. I do want to share this last example from the Caribbean context because it helps us get a sense of the really dynamic ways in which these young people are working with language to sort of pursue their social and academic goals. This is an example of a young musician who we call Cameron, who was born on actually French St. Martin and had some schooling experience in Dutch St. Martin, and then eventually convinced his parents to allow him to attend a performing arts school in New York City because he's very talented and has family in New York, and so across his visits would get to go to shows, and he got to see the sort of the opportunities for music education, music experiences in New York City, and so really wanted to complete high school in New York City, which he had an opportunity to do. So here he's talking about going to audition at this performing arts school before he is admitted to the school. And for his audition, the teacher asks him to sing the US National Anthem, which is curious because here's a young black boy from the Caribbean, and the teacher, as his, for his audition, asked him to sing the US national anthem, and he's able to do it, and he's able to do it in a way that, as she says, really blows him away. So this is a small but I think very powerful example of how particular cultures flow across the globe, and whose cultures sort of have prevalence and value, and so that's a little bit of a different talk. But I want you to notice the things that Cameron is able to do with language in this space. So the teacher is very impressed. Speaks about Cameron's voices having that it factor, like Whitney Houston. And then she talks about hearing Cameron, because he continues to go back and forth between St. Martin and New York City, and performs in St. Martin when he spends time there as well. And so she talks about listening to some of his music performances when he's in the Caribbean, and says how she barely recognizes his voice when he's performing in St. Martin. By that she means his accent. So it's very interesting, I think, to think about, again, the agency, but also the real work that Cameron has to do in order to be recognized as someone who belongs and who has an opportunity to, as someone who should be invested in the U.S. by showing his ability to sound American while he sings, and to be sort of aware of what that means, but then to also maintain legitimacy in the Caribbean space, which he also belongs to, and the work that he does with language, particularly accented Englishes, in order to do this work. So we see students with in some cases having some critical perspectives, doing some really strong and agentic work with language, and we also see some opportunities there for some critical inquiry, some critical discussions, some critical thinking about what it means to be a black transnational speaker of English in these post-colonial spaces, as well as in these more dominant world nations. Okay, so we will switch now to the context of India, New Delhi, which is where this young woman, Prisha, is from. So South Asia has its own very dynamic linguistic space, and has its own long and troubled colonial history in relationship with Great Britain as well. English is one of the official languages, but thousands and thousands of regional languages and dialects in this space. And I'm only sort of pointing us to the New Delhi region right now, which is where this young woman, Prisha, is from. So Prisha is, I met her as a graduate student, actually. She grew up in a Hindu family. English and Hindi were home languages for her. So in her home life, those were languages that she spoke growing up. In her community, Punjabi and Urdu was also spoken, so she can understand them, but she does not read or write in these languages. And for all of her schooling, she was educated in English. And so she saw herself as a native speaker of English, as an Indian person. She loved language and literature, and her desire was to be an English professor. And so after secondary school, enrolling in college and university in India, she majored in English literature, trying to pursue her goals of becoming an English professor. She talks about not receiving any indication that there was any trouble with her English. Through secondary school, she was a student that excelled and didn't have any troubles at all until she entered university, and then was made to realize or believe that she in fact did not belong in an English department, and that there was indeed quite a bit of trouble with her ways of speaking English. So in this story here, she is talking about her early experiences at university. In one case where her college professor, who's a native speaker of Hindi, so this is someone from the community, who is explaining the criticism of a particular poem in English. And she, as a new college student, is having difficulty understanding the interpretation, and she asked the professor to provide an explanation in Hindi, which is a shared language in this space. And that request is met with refusal. Not only does the professor refuse to translate the poem and the criticism of it, but her request results in her being ridiculed by her peers in the class, who begin giggling at her request, which really positions her as outside of this space in which the work sort of happens in English. The professor goes as far as to tell her that maybe she's not meant for an English department, and she should go somewhere else. And you can see here then what that does to this student, who says she loses her confidence in not only in a native language, what she understands as a native language for her, but in sort of her academic ability and her, her ability to sort of pursue this path toward being an English professor. We also, though, see how Prisha is beginning to take on this critical perspective and asking these critical questions about, why would her studies begin from a position that, that positions English as superior to other languages, and in this Indian context. English would not be translated, the content would not be made accessible, rather the student would be ridiculed for even expecting that. Across her time in Indian universities, she continues to experience what we sort of describe as racialized linguistic violence, because her ways of describing the violence that she does experience is quite visceral in many cases. This is another example in which a professor sort of pulls her aside in a class that she thinks she's been doing quite well in, to ask about her academic background, whether she attended an IB school or a convent school, which would signal being educated in English and also being sort of middle class or upper class. Had she ever studied Jane Austen or Charlotte Bronte before coming to university? And she confesses, no, I've never heard of these people before your class. And then the professor's very cruel remark to her is, perhaps you should read comics or pornography, given that your language is so underdeveloped. And Prisha talks about sort of being in disbelief that this is sort of the way in which her professor is sort of speaking with her, and she talks about this really psychosomatic response to this linguistic violence that she experiences, feeling that her anxiety and depression is kicking in, and saying that I always wanted to be in this space, but I'm not wanted there. Her story is powerful because she responds with defiance to this positioning by this professor, and she vows that not only will she earn a PhD, but she wants to do that in order to change the way that English is positioned and taught in the Indian context, which I think is a very powerful response. If you could think about the alternative ways that she could respond to this continuous positioning as not belonging in an English space. She makes a move to sort of branch out her studies, to sort of add an interdisciplinary lens to her work, and begins regaining her confidence as a new scholar of English literature. She does try then to, after her master's degree in India, to gain access to a doctoral program in English in India. And she tries for several years to get accepted and is not able to get accepted into a doctoral program in English in India. And because of that, then she again makes a strategic move to try to get accepted into a graduate program in the US. Because she's had all of these problems, her strategy is to earn first a master's degree. So she applies to a master's program, thinking that once she earns the master's, that would then make a doctoral program more accessible to her. Unsurprisingly, she then moves from having this sort of positioning as sort of not belonging in English spaces, which again, these are happening from sort of the positions of Indian professors who are occupying the positions of this white listening subject in India. Now in the US, these positionings are in fact happening from professors who are actually white and serving as sort of gatekeepers to English in that space. She comes in a transnational student from India, feeling a little bit shaky in terms of her confidence. She knows that India is considered to be a third world country. She's really aware of her accent and her cultural, her accent and her cultural differences from her peers and her academic background. And so she comes in already with these worries about how is she going to navigate in this space. Almost immediately, she recognizes that there seems to be, from her professor's perspective, some trouble with the ways in which she writes. Again, which is becoming familiar to her, she gets pulled aside and questioned about her ways of speaking and writing in English, with one professor saying the way she writes is just wrong. She talks about getting very vague comments on her papers that she's not able to sort of interpret or respond to, and is struggling and having quite a difficult time. Hello, Dr. Boyd. Thank you for being here. And so she continues to sort of wonder about what exactly the trouble is, because she's not really getting any clarity except that, whatever she's doing is incorrect. Until one of these professors sends her off for remedy, really, to another professor who is a multilingual scholar of writing, also in the same academic department. And so after experiencing so many of these instances, she decides to go visit with this professor, but at the same time she's again regaining that critical perspective that we saw her sort of display early on in India, when she talked about changing the way that English is being given to her students. So here she talks about a professor who's particularly harsh on multilingual students of color, and she says, which I think is quite beautiful, we do not write in standardized English. It's our movement between our first languages and English and where we come from that complicates the way we write our sentences and present our thoughts. It was what made us unique, but this uniqueness often worked against us. So she goes to visit with this professor who from the get-go assures her that there is nothing wrong with your language and your ideas are very strong. This professor sort of mentors her into ways that she can write to make herself understandable to people who are not willing to sort of do the work, really, to understand her ways with language, and she begins working on her writing in this way, and begins actually then finding success with the very professors in this very classes in which she initially struggled. Because she's then regaining her confidence, she takes on a position at the University Writing Center. She says that she always wanted to be a tutor, but given the ways that she had been positioned in these English literature classrooms, she had worried about taking on this position. And so she finally goes to the Writing Center and receives a position there. But then realizes that she is being avoided in terms of getting any appointments with other multilingual students of color, who assume because of her name and the fact that she's Indian that she is not competent in English and would not be able to support them. But she persists in this position, and eventually begins getting more appointments with other multilingual students of color who she's able to sort of share these practices with that she's been learning with this other professor. And so we see her forming this multilingual community of support that allows her to, her and the other students to really empower themselves. She, as we've seen, she's made some strategic decisions in terms of the ways that she will now write and work on her writing in order to achieve academic recognition and success in these spaces that are somewhat hostile. But she also makes some very intentional decisions about her own identity as a speaker of English. And so she makes some very deliberate choices about how she will or will not adapt her accent, which I think is also very powerful, where she says, I might as well resist the changes that may demand for me to cater to an American listener in a way that's demeaning to me but convenient for them. And she tells people assertively that I choose not to change my accent, really meaning that if you want to engage with me, you have to enter this position of also doing the work, embracing the fact that we are in a multilingual space, that we all have our relationships and rights to English and other languages, and if we want to be understood by one another, I have to do work and you have to do work as well. Okay. And so in sort of wrapping up and thinking what might this mean pedagogically, I sort of lean on the work of Lavia, who talks about how we think about pedagogy in post-colonial contexts like the ones in which we've been looking at tonight, where we continue to see these legacies of European colonialism. Lavia says, while we recognize the great harm that continues to be wrought in these spaces, we can also sort of use post-colonial theory as a foundation to think about a pedagogy of hope. And that begins with professional educators and students really engaging in a decolonizing discourse within these institutions and about these institutions. And here I would center language as a construct in which, around which these conversations need to happen as a foundation and as a starting point. So practically, what might this mean? I've talked a little bit about retheorizing immigrant students as transnational students. Dr. Chinchin Zhang Wu, another one of our brilliant scholars in CNV, is doing some work in the higher education space, retheorizing international students as transnational students and thinking about what does that mean for engaging with them as multilingual speakers and writers in higher education spaces. I know many of you in this higher education space have multilingual backgrounds and experiences. And one of the things I've argued is that if we're talking about transnational students in K-12, they don't suddenly stop being transnational when they get into college and university. So why would we stop thinking about what pedagogies might look like for them as they enter into these higher education spaces? One argument that Dr. Zhang Wu has made is that we likely have somewhat more freedom and flexibility in higher education literacy spaces to innovate and play with language and literacy education than we do currently in K-12 spaces. So what pedagogies might we innovate that might then have import in for K-12 spaces? So I find that to be a very interesting argument. In my book, Teaching Transnational Youth, I've developed ideas about what it means to take on critical language inquiry with transnational students. And I would add that we sort of really need these sorts of pedagogical practices right now, thinking not only of the context in which we find transnational youth in these dominant world nations, but how we get them to critically reflect on their language histories in their home countries. As well. And then a variety of scholars, Suresh Kanagaraja and others, have offered some pedagogical starting points for thinking about language and literacy education that really centers the multilingualism of transnational students. And finally, I want us to think about what does it mean to think about language policy advocacy from the bottom up. So what does it mean to engage communities in these conversations about the ways in which our local languages are positioned in school spaces What does it mean to advocate for language policies and practices that actually do center and honor and build upon the language practices in our communities in these school spaces, in these post-colonial nations and elsewhere as well. So I will end here. If you would like to learn a little bit more, I want to thank my former doctoral student, now Dr. Clara Collins, for helping me create a linked tree. So I'm very excited about it and excited to share it. I tried to update it, and so any errors on it are mine and not Dr. Collins. Thank you so much for engaging with me tonight. I think we have ample time for discussion. So I will stop here and see where our conversation takes us.
I think the floor is now open for comments, suggestions, points of discussion.